Ethnography of the Otomi Episode 1. Photographed, written, and podcast video produced, directed and programmed by Jack Lamb. Dr. Terry Stocker and Jack Lamb. Photograph taken in 1981 as we ascended the volcano, Pico de Orizaba, to explore, photograph and survey the lost Aztec mines. Even though the pothole-pocked road we followed snaked dizzyingly through the mountainous terrain, it was a refreshing change after 2 days of featureless highways. Not more than an hour later, Tula appeared in the distance, visible in the last red rays of the setting sun, surrounded by the dark silhouettes of the mountains standing sentinel over this once great hub of the Toltec Empire. Stocker eagerly lectured us on the landmarks and features of the valley, liberally spicing his narrative with history, mythology, and anthropological anecdotes. For 30 minutes, he talked of everything from the coming of the Toltec god Quetzalcoatl and the volcano-like peak Zacuco looming in the west, to the huge Miguel Hidalgo oil refinery. Belching voluminous clouds of fire and smoke into the eastern sky, the refinery boasted to be the largest oil processing plant in Latin America. Dusk had fallen by the time we reached Tula's plaza, where people gathered in the pleasant coolness of the evening. Pairs of young women strolled arm in arm along the square's esplanade, perhaps displaying their chaste charms and allure to the potential male suitors who stood nearby, while elderly couples sat staidly together on benches silently contemplating the perambulator's youth and the coming twilight. The ancient stone form of the church, Iglesia de San Jose, filled an entire block cornering the square. Built by the Franciscans in the mid-16th century, it stood as one of the older churches in Mexico, which explained why it looked like a castellated fortress rather than a church. Reddish-pink sodium vapor lights lit the upper portions of its bulwarks, coloring the carved and fitted stones to suggest the reflected flames of the fires of an army camped beneath its formidable walls. The next morning Stocker decided we would go to see his close friends Lupe and Lola, who lived in the colonia. So we started walking along the polluted Tula River to reach the bridge. "What is that stench?" I abruptly gasped. "It smells like shit." "It is shit," he responded calmly, studying me for my reaction. 60 miles south of here, Mexico City dumps a portion of the raw sewage produced by its 20 million people into the Tula River, which, as you might guess, flows through the center of Tula. "Ah, I see," I answered lamely, wanting to say more but realized it would be superfluous. We followed a narrow footpath cut into the side of the hill that switchbacked up the steep riverbank. On the way, we passed a shrine painted sky blue, dotted with white stars encircling a small alcove containing a statue that Barbara identified as Our Lady of Guadalupe. The inch-deep powdery dust layering the footpath, puffing into the air with each step we took, suggested that many people routinely traveled the trail daily. Climbing the last grade, the footpath joined a narrow dirt lane with indistinguishable one-story concrete block houses built on a flat ledge carved into the clay hillside. At the top of the bank, Otomi men and women gossiping in the dirt lane while children played in the deep dust, became eerily silent when they saw us. "Terencio?" a young woman queried when she looked up to see who waited in front of her house. "Hola, Lola," the archaeologist greeted her in turn. Before Lola greeted us in kind, she briefly turned away and shouted into the nearby dwelling, "Lupe," accenting the second syllable an octave and a fifth above the first in a sustained tone. A short, solidly built young man emerged from the small house, not much larger than a one-car garage. Smiling broadly as the spark of recognition lit his eyes, he greeted Terry and Barbara cordially. And after she introduced me, I shook hands with the young man. As Terry talked with Lupe and Barbara with Lola, the loitering men and women standing in the lane unabashedly listened to their conversations. Noticing her neighbor's blatant eavesdropping, Lola spoke to her husband, who immediately invited us into their house. Stocker had mentioned earlier that the young couple was descended from the Otomi, the same ancient race of Mesoamericans who built the Toltec Empire in the 9th and 10th centuries, and ruled from Tallinn, now called Tula. The name Tallinn means place of reeds because it lies near a small lake of reeds not far from the confluence of the Tula Grande and the Tula Chico rivers. Stocker had told me. A Mexican archaeologist, Moreno, identified Tallinn as the capital of the Toltec Empire, in part, because of its proximity to volcano-shaped Sacuco, which local legends say was once a major ceremonial center where priests came to pray and musicians to play at the house of Tezcatlipoca on its summit. The Aztec considered the Otomí to be their direct ancestors and cultural progenitors, claiming this justified the rise of their own empire a half-millennium later. And as to why later still, the Otomí fought for centuries as an elite mercenary corps for their Aztec overlords. Though Toltecs worshipped Quetzalcoatl, who only required animal sacrifice, they also were obliged to comply with Tezcatlipoca's demands, commanding they sacrifice humans in all religious rites. Stalker had explained. It's believed the plate in the Chicmul's hands once held the still-beating human hearts cut with obsidian blades from the chests of the living captives specifically kept to be killed at all sacrificial rituals. Both in their early 20s, Lupe and Lola displayed classic features genetic to their Native American heritage. Lola possessed an innocent beauty heightened by her bright eyes and augmented by the straight jet-black hair framing her face and hiding her forehead behind bangs cut above her eyebrows, while Lupe's youthful features emanated a noble honesty and straightforwardness. Yet paradoxically, a few seamed squint lines around his eyes suggested a depth of street knowledge well beyond his youth. Two shy girls appeared in the doorway of the kitchen holding a small boy between them, each mirroring the round faces, red skin and straight hair displayed by their Amerindian parents. Lola introduced the oldest as 5-year-old Erica, who peered at us with deep and darkly piercing eyes set in the face of an angel. Like her mother, Erica's bangs ended at her eyebrows, while two thick cords of red yarn tied her hair into a pair of short tails. Next, she presented 4-year-old Gloria, who looked like her sister except for the dirty tear trails smudging her face, and the blue ties fastening her pigtails. Lupe disappeared and returned with 3 bottles of cold cerveza, which Barbara informed me he bought in a tienda or store, at one end of the dirt path. Terry feigned being inordinately surprised that our host did not bring another beer for himself. In mock amazement, he asked Lola why Lupe was not drinking. ¿Por qué no toma Lupe? Lola's melodious laughter filled the room when she replied, followed by a terse retort from Lupe causing Stalker great amusement. And since I understood only half of what she said, I asked what was so funny. Lola says Lupe went drinking last night and got drunk. Terry explained. Because Lupe isn't feeling well, he promised Lola he would never drink again, but she doesn't believe him. Did you know at the tender age of 8 Lola had to go work in Mexico City as a housekeeper and cook? The archaeologist added. Working 7 days a week, she was only allowed to return to Tula to see her family once every 3 or 4 months, riding the bus alone, back and forth between Tula and Mexico City. It sounds like kids in Mexico lead hard lives. I responded. According to Terry Stalker, comparatively speaking, it had been much worse for Lupe and Lola's pre-Columbian Otomí ancestors. Boys in the Aztec Empire worked beside adults all day in the fields beginning at the age of 5. And when they turned 13 they not only married, they were expected to go to war with the men. Lupe and I met the first year I came to Mexico when I worked on Dan Heelan's excavation of an obsidian workshop. He was a wild kid who was always in trouble. Terry reminisced. Back then, I did a little stone carving, just small pieces. And one day I began teaching Lupe how to carve stone. And he had a real knack for it. Lupe started making copies of the artifacts we excavated at the archaeological site, and his work looked better than the originals we dug up. He admitted. In fact, his carvings were so much better than the Toltec artifacts, he sells them to tourists as originales. What's an originales? I queried. Originales are fake artifacts sold at pretty much every one of the archaeological sites in Mexico. Stalker answered. After Lupe carves a piece, he buries it in the earth for a few days so the dirt will add to the realism. He explained, obviously impressed by the talent and attention to detail of his protege. So after he has a stash of finished originales, he hangs around the temple complex, slides up to tourists when the guards aren't looking, and offers to sell them what look like artifacts covered in dirt. Look at this. The archaeologist said as he passed me the serpentine-colored stone, hefty for its size and exquisitely carved and polished. Inspecting the stone knife, I marveled at the skill, as well as eye for detail of the young Otomi. The highly polished inch-thick red stone was 7 inches long by 2.5 inches wide at the hilt, while gracefully tapering to a point at the blade end. Stalker explained the diverse aspects of the carving as he examined it. First studying the three-dimensional carvings on the hilt, at one end he saw a priest wearing a headdress shaped as a bird's beak, and at the other end he saw a stylized crocodile head adorning the other corner, likely Quetzalcoatl as the plumed serpent. There was also an incised etching of a man on the blade, a priest wearing a headdress and ear spool, with glyph swirls rising from his lips signifying speech or prayer. And while the image on the blade wielded an obsidian knife in one hand, he held a human heart in his other hand. Taken as a whole, he maintained that the inscribed etching depicted a priest offering the sacrifice of a human heart to the trickster god, Tezcatlipoca. Lupe has also started making small pottery pieces which he fires in a small kiln he built behind his house. Terry said in English before turning back to Lupe. ¿Tienes algunos originales terminados que están listos para venderse? He asked him eagerly, do you have any completed originales that are ready to sell? Lupe nodded his head affirmatively and knelt down to retrieve a small cardboard box stored under the kitchen cabinet. Lifting the heavy box brimming with examples of his handiwork wrapped in newspaper, he placed it on the table. Then one by one, he took each piece from the box and unwrapped it before handing it to Terry. Lupe molded the bisque-fired pottery from red clay lightly blackened with soot, each piece etched with a dull glaze painted on portions of the earthenware. Our primary expeditionary objective would be to climb to the upper reaches of the volcano, Pico de Orizaba, called Citlactépetl in the Nahuatl language of the Aztec. At 18,500 feet, it is the highest mountain in Mexico and the third highest in North America after Alaska's Mount Denali and Canada's Mount Logan. High on the upper slopes of the volcano we would explore, photograph, and survey a group of ancient obsidian mines quarried by the Aztec for centuries until the Spanish conquistadores arrived in the New World and destroyed their civilization. Consequently, these obsidian mines had been lost to history for the past 500 years. But because our ascent of the volcano would not occur for another 2 months, it gave us time to follow up on some of the archaeologists' other long-postponed endeavors. Hence, our current emphasis in studying the Otomí, who had lived along the Age Volcanico Transversal, the Trans-Mexican volcanic belt running laterally across central Mexico, for more than 6,000 years. San Pablito and Amati papermaking. With anthropologist Terry Stalker's interest in the Otomí reignited, he decided we should devote the next several weeks to interviewing and photographing this ancient vanishing people for a series of ethnographic magazine articles. In truth, I could not imagine doing anything better than playing a part in his research into the descendants of this ancient people who founded the Toltec Empire. The Otomi Maguey cactus houses were fascinating and considerably photogenic, and I had been hoping for an opportunity to photograph these unusual dwellings. Okay, now listen carefully, because before we begin, I need to teach you about Mesoamerican papermaking. He intoned before quipping mockingly. And you might want to take notes. Based on where they lived, ancient humans made paper from 6 basic types of plant fibers: papyrus, cotton, rice, bark, wood pulp, and hemp. He lectured. The Aztec made a type of bark paper called amati which they used to inscribe books which the Spanish called codices. The Aztec didn't have a written language, so codices were actually folding picture books detailing information in pictographs on each subject. He continued. Codices recounted narratives about mythologies and histories, delineated detailed minutiae regarding ritual and culture, calculated astrological auguries regulating people's lives, listed lineages of kings, and accounts of tribute payments from vassal cities. Several cultural groups the Aztecs subjugated paid tribute in amati paper. Besides using bark paper for books, it was used in ceremonies celebrating the Aztec calendar where the priests wore paper costumes and decked the altars with paper decorations. Few pre-Columbian codices survived since Itzcoatl, the 4th Aztec ruler, burned the historical codices to keep the knowledge they contained from his people. Then a century after the Spanish conquest, when the Inquisition swept through Spain, the Church destroyed most of the remaining Aztec and Mayan codices because they were considered heretical to Christian scriptures. Stalker revealed indignantly. I always thought the art of making bark paper was lost, but then I saw amati hand-painted with folk art for sale in a gift shop at one of the archaeological sites. He said intently. I asked where it came from and learned the Otomi produced it in a pueblo known as San Pablito, said to be in the mountains northeast of Tulancingo. In Tulancingo, Stalker asked many people how to get to San Pablito, until a man told him to take the northeast road from the city. This road proved reasonable for the first 15 miles, but deteriorated when it climbed into the mountains. Unsure where we were going, asked directions from a man walking on the shoulder who told us to go left after crossing a bridge. Then follow the tracks along the river. Taking the turnoff after crossing the river, we began following a pair of tire tracks through overgrown bottomland glades. Until the trail finally degraded to a single track, before veering away from the river to climb the slope where it turned into a narrow footpath all but undrivable as we drove into the forest cloaking the mountainside. Because the VW van was unsuited to the demands of the mountainous trail, the 20 miles we traveled to reach San Pablito took us over 8 hours of continual torturous driving, traversing an ever-steepening slope better suited to a four-wheel drive vehicle or a goat than an aging rear-axle drive van. By the time the track eventually ended at a group of huts, it was morning. After deciding to leave the van, we began walking through the village. Although the women we passed looked at us, oddly none replied to Barbara's Buenos Dias. Following a clamoring of hammers sounding like a noisy army of carpenters, we slowly moved through the village in search of the source of the commotion. We thought we were ready for anything, until we saw 50 women pounding stones against orange-colored tree bark laid across wooden planks. This must be San Pablito, Stalker stated in awe. The Otomi women kept working, and never responded to Barbara's repeated attempts to converse with them. Although it did occur to her, they might not speak Spanish. Fortunately, not long after, 3 older men appeared and welcomed us. Buenos dias, bienvenidos. Somos los ancianos del pueblo. One bid us welcome with an accent, as if not speaking his native tongue. We are the village elders. Aquí es San Pablito? Stalker asked, is this San Pablito? Sí, estamos en San Pablito. Another one of the elders answered coolly, yes, we are in San Pablito. ¿Why están haciendo amati esas mujeres? Stalker asked excitedly, and are those women making amati? Sí, hacer amati es industria tradicional de la gente de San Pablito. The elder replied, yes, making amati is the traditional industry of the people of San Pablito. ¿Qué están haciendo? Barbara interjected. What are they doing, as she pointed at the toiling women. Nuestras mujeres machacan la corteza hervida del árbol del janote para hacer el papel. Another Otomi elder replied courteously, our women pound the boiled inner bark of the janote tree into paper. Barbara did most of the talking now and learned the ancient craft of amati papermaking was the communal livelihood of the inhabitants of San Pablito. And because outside visitors seldom found their way here, the elders were willing to show us how they made the bark paper. While Barbara and Stalker spoke with the elders, I took a moment to examine the village. Although men dressed in modern shirts, cowboy hats, and trousers, women wore the traditional cap-sleeved dresses of white cotton, with multicolored, hand-embroidered yokes and hems with colored bands of cloth matching the sash wrapping their waists. As one might imagine, the boys dressed like the men and the girls dressed like the women. As we listened to the elders, it gradually became clear that the men of San Pablito knowingly kept their women living in a past era. The reason no woman responded to Barbara's attempts to address them when we first entered the village was that the men never taught their women how to speak Spanish, and so they only spoke Otomi. This suggested why the women and girls wore only traditional Otomi dress, whereas the men all wore modern Western clothes. Plainly, only men could adopt the language and mannerisms of modern Mexico, while the women had to live like the Otomi women of primitive ages past. Stalker asked what trees produced the bark they used to make amati. The elder called them arbol janote, arbol amati, and zalama limon, which made no sense to us. But later he sent a villager into the forest with us to show us the types of fig and mulberry trees required. Different species of trees produced different colored amati papers. Fig trees produced a coffee-colored paper, whereas mulberry trees produced a white to beige to yellow paper, depending on the age and girth of the tree. The villagers lived in grass-thatched roofed wooden huts, built around posts driven into the earth and lashed with horizontal branches used as furring strips to hold the vertical planking and split branches used for the walls. No one asked us inside one of the huts while we were in the village. But plainly, each contained a cook fire since we could see smoke rising from each roof. Though called the people of the Maguey and Hidalgo, there was no doubt, Otomi were remarkably adaptable and able to build homes out of cactus, stone, or wood. Clearly, this vanishing people could build a house out of whatever raw materials the environment provided. We spent the remainder of the day in San Pablito getting to know its people and the ancient procedure they used to make amati, passed down through word of mouth from one generation to the next from the time when their progenitors produced it as a tribute payment to their powerful Aztec overlords. Curiously, the San Pablito elders considered the production of amati paper to be women's work, and limited the involvement of men to gathering the inner bark from the trees in the early spring before the rainy season, when the sap flowed and it was easier to remove the outer bark. Many piles of inner bark lay scattered throughout the village, for they had to collect enough each spring to keep the women busy making amati paper throughout the year. To make amati, the women had to boil the inner bark to remove the sap and soften the fibers, so they would separate easily. Consequently, they stuffed the golden brown inner bark into large iron kettles of boiling water to simmer over blazing wood fires. Initially, the bark overflowed each kettle. But as it cooked, it became more pliant, allowing the women to push the excess below the surface of the boiling water with long-handled wooden paddles. After the bark boiled several hours, the kettles were allowed to cool so the pulp could soak overnight. During the next stage of making bark paper, in order to separate and macerate the pulp fibers, women pounded boiled pulp into strands with rectangular stones carved with finger grooves, mashing it so it might be matted, condensed, and pressed into sheets of all shapes and sizes. Then after the amati dried in the sun, it was stored in huts until shipped. This was what we heard the women doing when we entered San Pablito earlier in the day. Otomi artists decorated the amati with the folk art sold in the tourist shops at many of the archaeological sites across Mexico. During our stay in the village, we talked with two artists. The first was a preppy young man named Martin Aristio who showed us his collection of Christian-themed tempera artwork painted on coffee-colored amati paper. Not as widely known, they also had a few artists who produced the traditional amati demon glyphs required by Otomi shamanistic rituals for millennia. The other artist showed us an amati book containing these pagan themes, portraying several demon glyphs derived from Otomi spiritual incantations arranged on the white accordion-folded amati. These amati books must look much like codices the Aztec produced during the height of their empire in Mesoamerica. Each page displayed a pre-Columbian figure or glyph cut out from the coffee-colored amati paper, which the artist then pounded into the wet white amati page to produce an impressive two-colored folio. From what we learned from this artist, the practice of making amati paper has always been important to the Otomi religious rituals officiated by curanderos, who were the village healers and shamans. The figures in his book represented the evil spirits plaguing his people, to whom the curandero must make offerings to ensure the success of crops, ward off evil, and cure any sickness the demons might place on the villagers. The artist told us the animistic Otomi curanderos who live in these isolated mountains are experts in zaki, the animating force bringing life to all things. Because evil spirits and malevolent sorcerers disrupt zaki, it is the curandero's duty to put things right when they do. Amati paper figures represent the zaki of evil beings endangering the village, over which the shaman is able to gain power by manipulating the paper figures through ritualistic incantations. However, the artist ominously stressed how important it was for the curandero to burn the amati glyphs used in the ritual, because they now contained the dangerous zaki of those evil beings. Clearly, San Pablito was an enclave from another era that only survived because of its isolation, which allowed them to stay in touch with the beliefs of their forebears predating the Spanish conquest. While the village was not a throwback to the pagan world of their ancestors, neither did it exist solely in the post-Columbian Christian world. Rather, it existed somewhere between, managing to preserve a foothold in both worlds simultaneously. For example, Otomi ranked the beings of the world by the power of their Zaki, and Jesus ranked at the top of the list alongside the Otomi sun god Maguey. In this manner, they could maintain a balance where the pagan beliefs of their ancient heritage and the teaching of the Catholic priests coexisted without conflict. Truly, this was a remarkable accomplishment. The footpath bringing us to San Pablito continued on the other side of the village. But we never would have found it had not an elder shown it to us. Much later in the day, we walked this trail to investigate an ancient stone church sitting on an outcropping of rock above a sheer cliff. This abandoned church was the only stone building we saw that day in or near San Pablito. The elder said it had been many centuries since a priest lived in the church, so villagers only used it for special ceremonies. Stalker pointedly asked the elder if the rituals in these special ceremonies were Christian or pagan in origin. Not surprisingly, he never answered. We camped that night in the same clearing where we spent the previous night, and the next morning we began the torturous trip back to civilization. Because we knew what to expect from the trail down the forested mountain, it did not seem as intimidating as it did when we knew nothing about the difficulties awaiting us. Eventually reaching Tolancingo, we located a baños públicos and had steam baths and a change of clothes. Then we found a restaurante and ate a decent meal. I want to show you one of the first churches built in Mexico containing amazing murals depicting Indian warfare, beheadings, and other bizarre brutalities. Stalker announced provocatively. Photographing these murals has been on my list of things to do for nearly a decade. He added offhandedly. And since you've got your camera gear, it's probably the only time I will be able to get it done. Tell me where to point the Nikon and I'll shoot whatever you like. I posed amenably. That's what I hoped you'd say. He exclaimed with a satisfied grin before avowing fervently. Trust me, dude, these murals will blow your mind. Look for the next podcast episode of Ethnography of the Otomí. Episode 2.